Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Now, in our previous lecture, we began the discussion on inflation, yani ke ifrat-e-zar. Today, we will be able to conclude that discussion, hopefully, and start discussion on the third major problem, that is the problem of balance of payments disequilibrium. I hope you followed the discussion on inflation so far well, that you've understood the various concepts that we've introduced, because these are really very important, not only for a good study of inflation, but for a study of the money and banking systems. And once we get to that, all of what you assimilate now will come in very handy when we include the monetary sector later on in our course. Now, before I take off from where we left our previous lecture, that was at the stage of cost-push inflation, let me do a little recap on what were the major things that we learned in that lecture. We started by defining inflation as the rate of increase in prices. But we noted two issues with that definition. Firstly, we needed a measure for the price level, the price index. And we said that we could have different measures. We could have the student price index, health price index, food price index, consumer price index, producer price index. So when somebody made a claim about whether the prices were rising or falling in an economy, it had to be seen which particular index he or she was referring to. So this is also a good point for you. Whenever the government says that the inflation has come down, the inflation rate has come down, don't just take that statement at face value. Try to dig into what inflation measure, what price level index the government is using. Similarly, when the opposition chides that inflation is rising very fast, don't take that at face value either. Try to dig deeper and see which component of inflation are they talking about and whether inflation as an aggregate has gone up or not. We also talked about wage inflation, and we said that it was the relationship between wage and price inflation which determined whether the real wages in any economy were falling, increasing, or stable. And we associated the problem of falling real wages with corruption and inefficiency, especially of the salaried classes, that is the wage-receiving classes. We then discussed some costs of inflation. We looked at the redistribution of income costs from a redistribution of wealth costs, that is, the redistribution of welfare from the salaried classes to the landed or classes, or the classes which held property or assets. We then looked at the uncertainty costs that inflation brought. As you know, firms base their investment decisions on expected revenues, expected costs, that is expected profits. And if they don't know what the level of inflation or prices will be in the future, then they're unlikely to take on new projects or big investments. And as we discussed that as the level of inflation increases in the economy, the level of uncertainty about what the inflation rate will be, what the price level will be, increases. And therefore, this could have negative implications for the economy because the growth rate could suffer due to lackluster investment demand. We also looked at the balance of payments problems that high inflation can cause. If prices in the economy are rising, then this would make our goods uncompetitive or unattractive for foreign buyers and therefore reduce our exports, while at the same time our consumers will buy more goods from abroad because they'll find local goods more expensive. And therefore this will have a negative impact on the trade balance. That is, exports will fall and imports will rise. Finally, we looked at the wastage of resources that inflation brings. People are always thinking about how to guard themselves against inflation. Firms hire financial experts, accountants, who are constantly advising them, giving them new ideas about how to invest in this property or that property or hedge their risks so as to guard themselves against inflation. And all of these energies, these talents could be better spent in increasing the productive potential of the economy, in producing more goods and services. Similarly, restaurants have to change their price lists. Restaurants are just one example. All people who have price lists need to change them on a regular basis, and that can increase the costs. Then people generally spend more time worrying about what the price level will be and how they can get a better deal. So all of these are costs to inflation, which make inflation as a whole an undesirable thing. We then looked at the theories on the causes of inflation. We looked at the traditional Keynesian view on this, that is, inflation and unemployment were opposite sides of the same coin, especially when the economy was on the upward sloping part of the aggregate supply curve. And we looked at the Phillips Curve formalization of that statement. We looked at the trade-off that the Phillips Curve offered between unemployment and inflation. That is, unemployment could be reduced, that is, output could be increased, but only at the cost of higher inflation. And we saw that as you move further and further to the left in the inflation unemployment graph, then the rate of increase in inflation goes further and further up. And this is because the Phillips curve was convex to the origin. Those were the things that we discussed yesterday. Then we went into a discussion of cost-push inflation. And this is where we will start our discussion today. What we discussed yesterday was that in the 1970s, the oil price shock caused prices to rise. But this was not because of excessive aggregate demand. That is, it was not a case of demand-pull inflation. It was rather that costs were pushing up inflation from the production side, from the supply side. The costs of inputs increased, the cost of transport increased, the cost of producing goods increased for firms because oil was a major input in most production processes. And all of these factors caused the price level in many advanced countries and all over the world to increase. But demand-pull inflation could not explain this. When these different points, these different combinations of inflation output figures, inflation unemployment figures were plotted on the Phillips curve, we saw that the Phillips curve did not go through those points. Now, some people tried to reconcile these two things, that is, the existence of points outside the Phillips curve and the existence of an earlier Phillips curve, by suggesting that the inflation-unemployment trade-off can change over time. That is, the Phillips curve can shift outwards over time. But generally, the attractiveness of a stable trade-off, a stable Phillips curve in helping to explain the trade-off between unemployment and inflation fell. The desirability of that was considerably reduced in the 1970s, and people increasingly looked to other explanations for inflation. Cost-push inflation was one example. And the solutions to cost-push inflation were also naturally much different, very different from the typical Keynesian solutions of demand management. What were the solutions that people who identified inflation as mainly a cost-push problem identified or gave? Well, the solutions had to be supply-side solutions, because inflation was now a supply-side problem, not a demand-side problem. So we needed to look at how we could increase aggregate supply by encouraging more workers to take on jobs, and that could require the income tax rate reductions, which increase the incentive to work. Remember, we discussed it in the discussion on unemployment, that as the marginal income tax rate falls, the incentive to work, to earn the extra dollar, the extra rupee increases. So supply-side measures like that, cost reduction measures, ways in which the firms could, or the general producer or consumers could shift to other sources of energy other than oil, like solar energy or nuclear energy. These motivations strengthened Supply side measures could also involve reduction in wage and price controls which prevent prices from falling. Note that all these measures do not involve demand management. They are supply side measures or measures which relate to removing microeconomic distortions like price floors, etc. That is minimum wages and minimum food prices, etc., etc., because you're trying to tackle or remove the problem of inflation by reducing the price level. Some people also suggested that monopoly power of firms be reduced. Sometimes monopolies charge very high prices and they are able to do that because of their monopoly position. So when faced with a supply side shock, some economists suggested that we need to make sure that the monopolies are dismantled or not dismantled, at least they operate at a low average cost level and pass that low cost advantage to consumers by charging lower prices. So those were some of the solutions that were presented to tackle cost push inflation. Note that they are very different from the typical demand side solutions, demand management solutions that were relevant when we were talking about demand pull inflation. Now next I want to bring to your attention the relationship between demand pull and cost push inflation. And I want to introduce to you the cost push illusion argument. That is not cost push inflation, but cost push illusion. That is when rising prices are not caused by rising costs. So it is possible for economists or ordinary people to be misled when they see rising prices, and they might think that this is because of rising costs, but it actually could be a case of demand pull inflation. Now this was probably not the case in the 1970s. That was clearly a supply side shock. But let me give you a small example. Think of an individual going to a shopkeeper and asking him for a commodity or a good, right? The shopkeeper says, well, the price of this good was 100 rupees last month, but now because the wholesaler is charging higher prices, therefore I have to sell it for 120 rupees. So you might feel that this is an example of cost push inflation because the cost at which the shopkeeper gets the good has increased. So you go to the wholesaler and you ask him, sir, why have you increased your price that you are charging to the retailer? And the wholesaler might say that it's not my fault. My costs have increased. What costs have increased? Well, the procurement costs. The manufacturer is now charging me higher prices for this good, which I distribute onwards to retailers. So then you go to the manufacturer and you ask him, sir, why are you increasing your prices that you charge to the wholesaler? And the manufacturer might say, well, you don't see wages have increased, rental costs have increased, land is now more costly, more expensive, capital is now more expensive, the interest rate is higher. So all these costs need to be factored in. Raw materials are more expensive, therefore the prices that I'm charging are higher. Now, this would seem to suggest that this is an example of cost push inflation. But it might well be that the increase in wages that the manufacturer talks about, the increase in the prices of raw materials that the manufacturer talks about, is actually caused by higher aggregate demand in the economy. It might be that overall the level of employment of resources has gone up. That is, there is a perceived shortage of labor, which has pushed wages up. There is an increased demand for land, which has pushed land prices up. There is an increased demand for capital or loanable funds, which has pushed the interest rate up. So it could very well be demand factors which are trying to push inflation up or prices up. So this might seem as if this is a case of cost push inflation, while actually this is being caused at the heart by an increase in aggregate demand. So this is just something that I wanted to bring to your attention, that sometimes it's not so easy to discern between cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Now, my friends, let's move to the third theory of inflation, which is perhaps the most dominant one, most important one for today. And that is the quantity theory explanation of why inflation happens in any economy and what are the root causes of inflation or rising prices. Now, before I present a formal definition of the quantity theory of money, let me introduce you to the relationship between inflation, money, and budget deficits. We've been talking about budget deficits in the context of demand management. That is, we've said that when the government spends more, that is G increases, or taxes less, that is T falls, then those are expansionary fiscal policies, expansionary budgetary policies. The budget deficit expands. But we've not so far tackled the issue of how the government might finance that sort of expansion in expenditures. I mean, the government has to get the money from somewhere. Now, it is possible for the government to spend more if it taxes more, right? So it collects more tax revenues from one arm and it spends more from the other arm. But in that case, the G minus T figure would be equal to 0, because the government, the increase in government purchases or government spending has been fully financed by an increase in tax revenues. What happens when the government is running a real deficit? That is, the government spending is in excess of the taxes that the government raises. That is, G minus T is positive. What can the government do? Where can the government finance its budget deficit from? Well, there are three options that the government can resort to. I'm going to just talk about one option which is relevant and which will bring to your attention the relationship between money, inflation, and budget deficits. And that case is that the government can simply borrow from the central bank. What does borrowing from the central bank mean? We will discuss this when we discuss the monetary sector later on in the course. But at this stage, let me just say that it basically means printing more money. That is, printing new notes. So the government can simply print new notes and use those newly, freshly printed notes from the mint to spend or finance its new purchases of goods and services, or the new injection of demand that it is putting into the economy, right? So that is one option before all governments, to print more money. Now, monetarism highlighted the relationship between this approach of financing budget deficits and inflation. They said that whenever governments finance demand expansion policies or sort of expansionary fiscal policies by raising or printing more money, or by increasing the rate of monetary growth in the economy, then that leads to inflation. That is, that leads to a rise in price. How does that rise in price come about? We'll just look at it through the quantity theory of money. But note this relationship between expansionary fiscal policy and an expansion in the money supply. That is, the monetarists were trying to bring to the attention of everyone the relationship between more government spending and an increasing money supply. Keep this at the back of the mind, and let's now look at the quantity theory of money. Now let's look at the relationship between money and inflation, money and prices. We've looked at the relationship between budget deficits and monetary growth. Now let's look at the relationship between money and inflation. Now, the key insight that monetarists gave here was that they said that the demand for transactions in any economy should be equal to the supply of transactions. What is the demand for transactions? Well, the example can simply be given of a person who has rupees 100 in his pocket, and he takes it to buy something on the market, right? So he goes and he purchases something for rupees 100, let's say a CD. Now, the person who sells the CD doesn't leave that 100 rupee note in his pocket. That 100 rupee note has a long way to travel. That CD seller goes and spends that 100 rupee note in a restaurant, right? So what does the restaurant owner do with that money? The restaurant owner then spends it on, let's say, the purchase of toothpaste, right? He has to buy toothpaste for the house, so he spends 100 rupees on toothpaste. And then that 100 rupees that the toothpaste seller gets, he spends on petrol, right? And then the petrol owner who gets that 100 rupees then spends it on a nice haircut. So look at the amount of transactions that a single 100 rupee note can entail. The single 100 rupee note went round how many times? 5 times, right? So the total value or the total demand for transactions that a single 100 rupee note, that is the money supply in the economy, can generate is 100 multiplied by the number of times that the money goes around in a particular period of time. So let's say if we are talking about a year, and in this case that 100 rupee note went around 5 times, then the total transactions that that 100 rupee note can finance is 100 times 5. So this is the demand side of the transactions. What is the supply side of transactions? Well, the supply side is simply the total quantity of goods produced in the economy multiplied by their respective prices, right? So it's all the producers producing everything multiplied by the price level prevailing in the economy. So the supply side of transactions would simply be, or the seller side of transaction would simply be price multiplied by quantity. So the demand side was money, that is M, multiplied by velocity. Velocity is simply the number of times the money goes around. In this case it was 5. Whereas the supply side was price times quantity. Now the price here was 100 and there were 5 items that were sold. So the quantity was 5. So it would be 100 times 5. And therefore you have 500 equals 500. This simple formula, MV is equal to PQ, is the quantity theory of money. Now the key argument that the monetarists gave was that in this simple equation, MV equals PQ, V was constant, that is the number of times the 100 rupee note or whatever the stock of currency is in the economy, the number of times it goes around in the economy is a fixed value. Sort of it doesn't change very much from year to year. And it seemed like a reasonable assumption. That is, the number of times any 100 rupee note would go around in this year would be similar to what it would go, how much times it would go around in next year and then the year after. So the velocity of money, they said, was stable. Later on, this assumption was questioned, and we will come to that in our discussion on the monetary sector. So this was one insight. They said that velocity is fixed. They also said that quantity, the output level, was fixed or stable. That is, they were talking about the full employment level of output. And note that monetarists were the one who gave the natural rate of unemployment theory. That is, they were the ones who said that the economy was at its natural rate of unemployment, and then the only thing that we now need to concern ourselves is the distance between the AJ and LF curves. That is, we need to talk about frictional unemployment and seasonal unemployment and structural unemployment, which explained the gap between the LF and AJ curves. So the monetarists said that the quantity of output that is produced is also sort of fixed, and therefore any increase in M would directly translate into an increase in P. So we have that equation MV is equal to PQ. So if V and Q are fixed or constant or stable, then any increase in M will directly cause an increase in P. So the key thing that monetarists said was that the direction of causality runs from money to inflation, or money to prices. That is, a rise in monetary growth, or a rise in the amount of money that is available in the market, will cause a rise in inflation or a rise in the price level. And this is what was formalized by Milton Friedman when he said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, what were the implications of the quantity theory of money for the Phillips curve? We keep going back to the Phillips curve because really the Phillips curve is a very powerful tool which you can use to explain demand pull inflation. Then shifts in the Phillips curve can be used to explain cost push inflation. Let's see how the Phillips curve plays out in the context of the quantity theory of money. We need to introduce a few terms here, and the terms are money illusion, adaptive expectations, and vertical Phillips curve. I'll start from the bottom. Vertical Phillips curve is simply a Phillips curve which is vertical. We saw earlier that the Keynesian Phillips curve was a downward sloping Phillips curve, right, with a negative slope. But monetarists said that the Phillips curve was vertical, and they made use of two concepts, two analyses, one regarding money illusion and the other regarding adaptive expectations. Let's look at what these two concepts were in order. Now, what is money illusion? Money illusion takes place when people who receive money feel that it increases their real wage or real incomes. So let's say a person receives an increase in his nominal income, that is the cash that he gets. Let's say he receives an increase of 10%. So he will be very happy, right? He will have this 10% higher income in his hands. He will go to the market and he will try to buy 10% more goods, right? Because his purchasing power has increased. But now think, if the government or the whatever firms suddenly pay 10% more wages to all the workers in the economy, right? So wages as a whole increase by 10%. So if everybody has 10% more money in their hands and everybody goes into the market to buy the goods and services that are already available, what do you think will happen to prices? Yes? Yes, prices will rise by 10%. Because note that the quantity of goods and services is fixed. We have not talked about any change in the quantity of goods and services that is available for consumers to buy. It's just that the nominal wages of consumers have gone up by 10%. So they all feel some kind of an increase in their purchasing power. This is why it is called money illusion. The increase in purchasing power that they feel is an illusion. It is not a reality. That is why once they go into the market, they find that all the prices are gradually rising, and that 10% money or nominal increase in wages that they received was actually worth nothing. That is, that their real wages have not increased. But the process by which consumers realize that the increase in nominal wages are not equivalent to an increase in real wages involves a change in expectations, or what consumers think is going to happen to prices. So note that when the consumer or when the worker initially receives the 10% nominal increase or a currency increase in his wages, he feels very happy. Why does he feel happy? Because in his mind, the prices of all the goods and services in the economy are fixed, are stable, and he suddenly has 10% more income. But now as he goes into the market, he gradually discovers that the prices have risen. So his expectations about future prices are adapting. That is, he is now changing his expectations about future prices. And therefore, actual inflation is expected inflation now becomes equal to actual inflation, and vice versa. Actual inflation starts shadowing expected inflation. This equality of actual versus expected inflation happens over a period of time. That is why it is called adaptive expectations. That is, expectations of consumers that adjust only gradually. Note that this is different from Keynes's view, which was that of static expectations. That is, people do not expect prices to change in the next period because they expect them to be the same as in the previous period. But note that Keynes was operating in times of recession. Here, monetarists are talking about a situation where the economy is already at its full employment level. That is, more output cannot be produced, and therefore prices will rise as the demand for that same quantity of output increases. So that was money illusion and adaptive expectations. Let's look at a slide to see how these concepts apply in the context of a Phillips curve and give rise to the vertical Phillips curve. Now let's look at this graph that we've drawn with a nice scale in there as well. We have inflation on the vertical axis and we have unemployment on the horizontal axis. and we have the typical Phillips curve which captures the inflation unemployment trade-off, right? So this is a typically shaped Phillips curve. Now assume that the economy has zero inflation and 8% unemployment to start with. That is, we start at point 1. Now let's say the government wants to reduce unemployment to 4%. That is, it wants to exploit the unemployment inflation trade-off. Now expansionary demand policies, which in this case would mean an expansionary fiscal policy implemented through an increase in the money supply, because remember we assume that the government finances its extra budgetary expenditure through printing money. So expansionary fiscal policies and monetary policy will mean that the money supply will increase. Because expected inflation is zero, that is, the consumers still suffer from money illusion, the increase in the money supply will be misinterpreted as a real increase by workers and by wage earners. Firms will begin to increase output, employ more workers at higher nominal wages. The economy moves along short-term Phillips curve, therefore, and reduces unemployment to 4%. Gradually, however, as the money illusion disappears, that is, expected and real inflation converge, that is, become equal, firms reconsider their plans for increased production. Those in the labor force who accepted jobs because they believed that real wages had increased now realize that they are not achieving their target salary, so they return to their unemployed status. Therefore, unemployment returns to 8%, but inflation remains at 2%. That is, we move from point 2 rightwards horizontally. Then, let's consider how the economy moves to point 3. Now, if the government again attempts to reduce unemployment, like it did when it was at point 1, if it again tries to do that, the economy will move along the blue short-run Phillips curve. Again, a short-run reduction of unemployment to 4% can be achieved at a cost of pushing inflation up to 6%. Again, this is a temporary improvement in unemployment. As expected inflation, that is 2%, converges to real inflation, that is 6%, unemployment again will return to 8%, but note that the increase in inflation will remain. Now the movement from 1 to 2 and then again from 3 to upwards will continue as long as the government tries to reduce unemployment at the expense of inflation. And the result of this is that there will be to and fro movements. To and fro means aage piche. There will be to and fro movements from 1 to 2, then from 2 to 2 prime, then from 2 to prime to 3, then from 3 to 4, and so on. And this will give rise to the long-run Phillips curve. The long-run Phillips curve is the intersection of the downward-sloping Phillips curve with the points that the long-run Phillips curve yields, that is the combination of points 1, 2 prime, and 4. And note that this long-run Phillips curve it occurs at the natural rate of unemployment level. This was the other part of the monetarist theory, that the Phillips curve is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment, which in this case would be 8%. Note that in this case, it is not possible to exploit the inflation-unemployment trade-off. What does it mean to exploit the inflation-unemployment trade-off? It simply means that the government cannot move along the Phillips curve, the same Phillips curve. That is, it cannot reduce unemployment by increasing inflation. You know, often political governments are under pressure to reduce unemployment in the economy. But if they take or undertake demand policies or sort of demand expansion policies which reduce unemployment temporarily but cause higher inflation in the long term, then that is not in the long-term interests of the economy or the country. So this is exactly what the monetarist economists said. They said that any attempt to exploit the short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And this would be successful in the short run. Why? Because of money illusion and adaptive expectations. But they said that once the adaptive expectations had come into play and expectations were equal to the actuals, then the trade-off will disappear, and that is, you would reach a level where the unemployment would still be the same, but inflation would have gone up. Now note in this case that the unemployment rate has not changed. That is, from points 1, 2 prime, 4. The unemployment rate is the same, but inflation has gone up on a permanent basis or permanently. Does this remind you of something that we discussed in our previous lecture? Hysteresis. Yes, it's a temporary change in unemployment which has caused a permanent change in inflation. That is a temporary change in unemployment. That is, unemployment temporarily goes down and then comes back. Temporarily goes down, then comes back. But inflation has been permanently raised from 0 to 2% to 6%, etc., etc. And this can also be conceptualized as hysteresis behavior of the economy. Now, what can we say about the policy suggestions that would come out of this discussion or this representation of the Phillips curve, that is the vertical representation? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that Keynesian policies that would seek to increase demand and reduce unemployment will not work, at least not in the long run. The unemployment-inflation trade-off can only be exploited for a very short time, within which consumers suffer from money illusion. But once that disappears, then you are back at the natural rate unemployment level, that is on the vertical Phillips curve. So in this case, what causes the economy to gravitate back to the vertical Phillips curve? It is the rise in inflation. What is causing the rise in inflation? Demand management policies of the government. Note that we've assumed that when the government increases its spending or reduces its taxes, it finances the resulting budget deficit, G minus T, through an excessive printing of money, that is by printing more money. And the increased money flow or the increased currency in the economy causes prices to rise. Why does it cause prices to rise? Because of the quantity theory of money, that is MV equals PQ, where V and Q are constant, so any increase in M will cause an increase in P. So what were the solutions to inflation that monetarist economists gave? Well, the obvious solution was that keep the money supply fixed. If you want to undertake expansionary demand policies, then at least don't finance the resulting budget deficits from monetary growth. That is, don't borrow from the central bank, don't print money, right? That was one major policy suggestion that came out. The other was that over the long run, it is possible for Q to grow as well. That is, the output, the real GDP in the economy, that is represented by Q, can grow at some fixed rate. That is 2%, 3%, 4%, sometimes even 7%. The rate might change as well. So the idea was, or the policy suggestion that monetarists gave was that the money supply should shadow the GDP growth rate, the expected real GDP growth rate. That is, any increase in M should be equal to the increase in Q. Any increase in M which is greater than the increase in Q will cause what? Will cause an increase in prices, and that is what we don't want. So the major policy insight or the policy suggestion given by monetarists was that keep the growth of money supply fixed or tied to the expected growth of real GDP. So that, my friends, was the monetarist theory of inflation, based around the quantity theory of money and giving policy suggestions relating to the restricted growth of money supply. Now, the quantity theory and the implications, the policy implications that it had, were quite serious from the 1980s. Many governments, especially the United States, took on policy advice from the monetarist economists and experimented with restricting its money supply growth and this had profound implications for the world economy as well, for interest rates, for the US dollar. So really quite a powerful theory in terms of its policy impact. Monetarism generally has been quite powerful. It's been the latest theoretical breakthrough in macroeconomics since the 1950s, after the classicals, the Keynesian, and then the monetarism theories of unemployment and inflation. There have been variants of monetarism in terms of real business cycle theories and rational expectations economists, but they have derived inspiration and insights from monetarist economists like Milton Friedman. That concludes our discussion on inflation. It was quite an intense discussion. It's a very important discussion, particularly from your exam point of view. All of this is important, but particularly the three theories about inflation, the demand pull, cost push, and the monetarist theories of inflation are very important. So with that, my friends, we can move to our next topic, the next problem, macroeconomic problem that we need to address, and that is the problem of having a balance of payments which is in disequilibrium, that is an external sector that is in disequilibrium. What do you mean by the balance of payments, or what are we discussing when we talk about the balance of payments? It's quite hard. It's not simple. Probably the hardest topic that we've discussed so far in macroeconomics. The next topic, growth, is relatively easier. Balance of payments is found to be tough by many people, not just economists or students reading economics at the introductory level, but by very many economists. It's quite a complicated topic, and we will need to spend a good lecture and a half to fully understand and develop foundations for this. What are we talking about when we discuss the balance of payments? We're talking about any individual country's transactions with the rest of the world, right? So it's Pakistan's transactions with the rest of the world, which we need to talk about when we are talking about the external sector or the balance of payments. You're talking about payments that are made to foreigners and payments that are received from foreigners. That is why the term payments in there. When you talk about balance of payments, the accounting implication of that is that payments that are made outside and payments that are received inwards should balance on average. That is, they should balance in an accounting sense. Otherwise, the economy would be declared bankrupt or something. So that's what the balance of payments generally means. Let's develop an understanding, intuition for what kind of transactions can Pakistanis have with the rest of the world. Well, some of these transactions we've already talked about. We've talked about exports. When Pakistanis export their goods and services, then they send our goods and services abroad and receive money payments in exchange, that is, payments from consumers in other countries in the rest of the world. Similarly, Pakistani consumers import goods and services from abroad. That is, the goods and services come into the country and money payments go outside. That is, we pay the producers of the rest of the world. But we can also have other transactions, like foreign investment coming into Pakistan, whether it is in the form of direct investment, that is, foreign investors come and set up plants and machinery or restaurant chains or whatever, or it is in the form of portfolio investment, that is, people investing in Pakistani stocks and bonds, etc. So both types of investments are also examples of transactions with the rest of the world. What are some other examples? Something that we talk about a lot, debt, foreign debt. So when Pakistan incurs new debt, new foreign debt, whether it is with the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, or some other bilateral donor, then that's also an example of a transaction with the rest of the world. Money is coming in. Then when we pay a debt service on this debt, that is, when we retire this debt or pay interest on it, then that's also an example of a transaction with the rest of the world. These are just some of the examples of transactions that Pakistan can have with the rest of the world. Now, in developing an understanding of the balance of payments, it's very important to simplify the analysis to the extent that it can be simplified. And I will do that by simplifying the world to consisting of just two countries. That is, there is Pakistan and there is the United States. And there are just two currencies. There is the Pakistani rupee and there is the US dollar. If we simplify it to this, it will become quite easy to understand how the market for foreign exchange operates, what are the demand and supply factors in that market. And let's now turn to that. Now that we've assumed that there are just two economies in the world, Pakistan and the United States, and there are just two currencies, the US dollar, which is used in the United States, and the Pakistani rupee, which is used in Pakistan, then we automatically get into problems of which currency to use when we are in the realm of inter-country transactions. That is, when Pakistanis export their goods to the United States, the people in the United States will pay in dollars, right? But when the Pakistanis receive those dollars, they need to convert it into rupees in order to buy things locally, right? They can't go to a bookshop and say that here are $5, give me a certain book. The currency that is locally used is rupee. Similarly, when Pakistanis import goods from abroad or from the US, then they will need to pay in rupees. But the producers in the United States will not be interested in your rupees. They will be interested in dollars because that is the currency that is used in the United States. So this introduces the problem of a foreign currency. That is, sometimes when we deal, or most of the times when we deal with some foreign country, in this case when Pakistan deals with the US, the agents there demand payments to be made in the US dollar currency, whereas the agents here want the payments to happen in the Pak rupee currency. Now the US dollar market, the market for US dollars, is the foreign sector market or the foreign exchange market from the Pakistani point of view, whereas the rupee market is the foreign exchange market for US agents, right? So this is important. Because there are only two currencies in this world, the only foreign currency for Pakistanis is the US dollar. So we need to understand how the market for the US dollar operates within Pakistan. What are the demand and supply forces in the US dollar market within Pakistan? Whereas the same analysis has to be done by US agents. They need to look at what's happening in the market for foreign exchange. And the foreign exchange in this case would be the Pakistani currency, which is the foreign currency from their point of view. So in order to understand the balance of payments, the balance of all the transactions that any economy undertakes, it's important to understand how the market for foreign exchange is clearing, or whether it is clearing or not. So we need to develop an understanding of the market for foreign exchange. Because we are sitting in Pakistan, we will take the Pakistani perspective. That is, we look at the market for US dollars and what are the supply and demand factors that drive that market. And then we will try to develop an understanding of the balance of payment from there, balance of payments from there. Let's look at a slide in order to illustrate how the demand and supply curves can be drawn for the market for foreign exchange, that is the market for US dollars. Now, as you remember from your microeconomics lectures, when we draw the demand supply curves for any market, for any good, we have the quantity of the good on the horizontal axis and the price per unit of that good on the vertical axis. So if the good that we are talking about is apples, then we'll have the quantity of apples on the horizontal axis, whereas we'll have the price per apple, price divided by apple on the vertical axis, that is the unit price of apples. And then we draw the supply and demand curves in that PQ space. Now the same principle applies to dollars as well, that when we are discussing the market for dollars. On the horizontal axis, we will have the dollars, the quantity of dollars in the market. Whereas on the vertical axis, we'll have the price per dollar, that is the unit price of dollars. Now what will be the unit price of each dollar? Think about it. The unit price of each dollar will be in terms of rupees, that is 50 rupees per dollar or 40 rupees per dollar. That is the amount of rupees that a Pakistani consumer or a Pakistani agent has to pay in order to buy $1. The principle is exactly the same, that when you pay a certain amount to buy an apple, now the apple is replaced by the dollar. So price per dollar is simply the rupees that you need to pay in order to get the dollar. So automatically you get the exchange rate on the vertical axis. The exchange rate is simply the number of local units of local currency units that are required to buy one foreign currency unit. And the rest is the same. You will have an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, as you had in the case of the market for apples or any other good, right? So there is no other difference. The only important point here to note is the difference in axes. That is, now on the vertical axis we have the exchange rate, but that is simply the price per dollar that the consumer or the market players have to pay. Now, as you know, my friends, whenever I draw a demand-supply diagram, I like to talk about what factors would cause shifts in the demand curve and what factors would cause shifts in the supply curve. So why should we spare the foreign exchange market? Let's now try to study what factors would cause shifts in the demand and supply curve for dollars, right? We had dollars on the horizontal axis. So what factors do you think will increase the demand for dollars? That is, shift the demand curve of dollars to the right. Any ideas? Well, certainly, a higher demand for US imports will cause the demand curve to shift to the right. What else? Yes, a need to pay more debt service, that is a need to make debt service payments to the US, will also cause the demand of dollars to increase, because we'll need to buy dollars and then pay those dollars to the US government. What factors do you think will affect the supply of dollars in the market? Yes? Yes. Let's say foreign investment comes into Pakistan from the US, then those foreign investors will come and they'll bring dollars with them and then convert those dollars in the market. So they will offer the dollars in the market. They will generate the supply of dollars, and that will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. Any other factor? Yes. An increased demand for Pakistani exports to the US by US customers. If US consumers want to buy more Pakistani goods, then they will be willing to spend more on Pakistani exports. There will be more dollars coming in from abroad through export of goods and services, and therefore the supply curve will shift to the right. Note that the demand for dollars is being generated in the market through all these different factors. Imports, the demand for imports, the need to make debt service payments. When people go abroad, they need dollars to travel. So those are the people causing the demand in the market. Whereas the supply of foreign exchange is being generated by the exports, the amount of money coming in through investment, etc., or the debt that Pakistan incurs, that also causes an increase in the supply of dollars locally. The market for dollars is as real as any market in the economy, like the market for apples. There are buyers, there are sellers. Just as you can go to these foreign exchange bureaus and you can give them rupees and buy dollars. More or bigger transactions happen in banks or financial institutions where millions of dollars worth of transactions are done. So the market for foreign exchange is exactly the same like any market. It has the same principles, it operates in the same way. Now we'll have to stop our discussion on the balance of payments at that. In our next lecture, we'll develop a little bit a better understanding of the market for foreign exchange, and then we'll lead that into a discussion of the balance of payments, the current account part of the balance of payments, the capital account, the change in foreign exchange reserves, how that relates to the exchange rate regime that is prevalent in the economy, that is whether we have a fixed exchange rate regime or a floating exchange rate regime. So, my friends, is it getting easier for you? I hope not. I hope things are becoming more challenging, because otherwise the fun in studying would disappear. And as we move along, indeed, things are going to become a little bit harder. Balance of payments is not the easiest part of macroeconomics. We'll be looking at the interactions between the four problems that we discuss later on, which is also not very easy. Then we'll move to the monetary sector. and that's not easy either. So things are becoming more and more challenging, but this is the fun of economics. I hope you're enjoying it. I hope that you put in the necessary amount of effort. Look at those questions that I've put up for you on the web. Try to clarify your concepts through the lecture handouts by reading the books that I've suggested. And I'm sure that at the end of the day, you will understand economics as well as I understand it or anyone else does. Hopefully better. So till our next lecture, it will have to be Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.